Hi, I'm Chris from CodeReviewVideos.com, and in this video we're continuing on with our tested wallpaper upload implementation. So towards the end of the previous video we saw that we could add a wallpaper, and we were almost there. We've got some visual weirdness going on, and if we choose a file and then manually fill in some slug and a width and a height, it doesn't really matter what they are at the moment, try and save those changes. We're sort of almost there, but if you remember from our prototype in our wallpaper upload listener, we did have a step just here where we filled in some additional properties on the entity, such as setting the file name and the width and the height dynamically. So let's start by checking out where we're up to with our tests. So when we run our tests, we're not in terrible shape. We've got 6 passes and 1 broken test. And we can see here that PHP spec is looking to our file interface to find a method called getExistingFilePath. And it's asking us if at this stage PHP spec should go ahead and create that method signature for us. We want to hit N here because we don't want that. As you recall towards the end of the previous video, we've been looking at our file interface and it didn't really make any sense for a file to be able to know its existing path and then that it should be in any way aware of how its new path would be determined. So as you can see, PHP Storm is giving us a little bit of a hint as to what's going wrong here. It's saying method get new file path not found in string. And this doesn't sort of immediately make sense. Like, why is it looking to a string? But let's follow this through. So we've told PHP Storm that our entity variable is going to contain an object of type wallpaper. If we browse to the wallpaper, we can see that we have a property called file, which currently is type hinted to be a string. So let's change that now to be a file interface. So if you're not using PHP Storm or similar, then you will also need to add in the appropriate use statement. What we should also do at this point is find the getter and setter for file and make sure that we return a file interface and that we take a file interface. And so now if we jump back to our wallpaper upload listener and hover over either of these, you can see now it's not looking at a string, it's now looking at this file interface, and it's realizing that the methods that we're trying to call here don't exist on that interface. So if we just click inside the opening bracket of move and press Command P on a Mac, then we can find the method signature for this file mover move method. You can see we need an existing file path and a new file path. So we know from our file that the existing file path is just going to be the current path name. A little more tricky, however, is figuring out the new path. So we can't just use the file name. We need to use the file name concatenated with the eventual path, which in our case is going to be the web images directory. So what we'll do here is just change this to be new file location. That's a variable that doesn't exist yet. So we'll just set that up here and just leave it as an empty string for the moment. And then, as you may recall, a few videos ago, we'd already solved this problem when taking our untested approach. So I've got the repository open as of video 20, which is the video after we'd finished doing our prototype. We're going to source, @bundle, service, and then wallpaper file path helper. And we have our basic implementation here, which takes the new file path and concatenates it with our known wallpaper file directory. So I'm just going to take a copy of that class name and then up arrow there, change this to desk. In other words, to describe, @bundle, service, and then that wallpaper file path helper. And then I'm going to run that particular test in isolation, and I'm going to let PHP spec create that file for me. Okay, so let's open up the spec and also the implementation. And let's just split these so that we can work on them more easily. So let's take one more look at the class that we're trying to re-implement. We know that we're going to get a constructor argument given, which is a string, contains the wallpaper file directory, and that when given a file name, it returns that file name concatenated with whatever we passed into our constructor. So let's add that in as knowledge into our tests. We'll start off by letting. In other words, every time this test is run, the underlying wallpaper file path helper object is going to need to be constructed, and we want to make sure that that construction process always contains a string, unless maybe we're testing that particular problem. In other words, if we don't pass in a string, then what happens? It should throw. So we'll say let, and then we'll just say this be constructed with, and we can pass in anything here, but I'll just say new path 2, and we likely want to add on a trailing slash there as well. Maybe that's something we could cover with a test. And then we'll add in another test that just checks that it concatenates properly. Now, because that's stretching slightly, what I'm going to do is just drop this down onto a couple of lines. This has no impact on how this works at all. It's purely for visual reasons. Okay, so we can be fairly lazy about this. If we run our tests now, PHP spec has noticed that we don't have a constructor. It's going to say yes, just hit return for that, let it create the constructor, which it's gone ahead and done. And then it's saying, should it create this get new file path method? Yes, I'd like it to do that also. So if you enjoy typing, you can go ahead and retype all this out. I'm not the biggest fan of typing needlessly, so I'm just going to copy and paste our implementation as it was before. Unfortunately, if you do that and you don't use the raw method from GitHub, then yeah, it generally tends to make a bit of a mess of that. But otherwise, this should all be good now. And a question you may have at this point is, why don't we have an interface for our wallpaper file path helper? And this comes down to personal preference, honestly, but I don't see a need. At this point, I don't see that we're going to have other file path helpers, but maybe if we get to that point at a future date, then adding an interface or standardizing this to some sort of interface would make sense. Otherwise, for me, it just feels like over-engineering. One thing that I would do now, though, is make this a little bit more robust. So even during testing, I almost forgot to add on the trailing slash. And whilst that's not that big of a deal, because we're going to use some sort of service definition to pass in this parameter, it's not like this would be newed up during runtime by the developer in any way. Even so, it would make sense to add in a little bit of guard logic. So let's add in another test to make sure that we always have a trailing slash in our constructor argument. So we'll copy out this part of the test we've already done, but what we'll do is we'll override that let statement and we'll just say this be constructed with, and we'll say whoops, no trailing slash. And then what we'd like to see is that it still concatenates properly. So we want it to come out something like that. So let's run that now and see where we get. Yeah, that's not particularly helpful. It's pretty much just telling us everything that we already knew and then just cutting off where it matters most. Never mind. Let's try and fix it anyway. So we know that we're going to pass in some string here, and then we're going to try and set it onto this class property. Let's create ourselves a private method, and we'll call this ensure has trailing slash, which will be given a string and then some path. And so what we want to do is just check the final character in the given path is a slash. So we can use substring for that. So we'll say if substring of the given path at position -1, in other words, the final character in the string, if you give a negative number, then it starts from the end. If you give a positive number, then it starts from the start. And we'll just say if that is equal to slash, then simply return the path because that's what we want. Otherwise, return the path, but concatenate it with a slash. So in other words, whichever situation gets passed in, whether it's got a trailing slash to begin with or it's not, we should be good. And then what we'll do here is we'll say this, ensure has trailing slash, and I'm going to pop this on a new line, wallpaper file path directory. Let's give our test a shot, and that looks good. Now, more likely to happen is that the file name that gets passed in contains a leading slash. And if it contains a leading slash, then we would end up at some point looking like that, because we'd have the trailing slash already on, and then this new file path has been passed in with a leading slash, and we'd end up with this double slash that we don't want. So let's again write another test for that. So again, I'm just going to take a copy of our existing test, the one that worked, and then I'll add on a slash here, but maybe I'll just change that to another just to vary it up a touch. And then what we're saying is that we shouldn't see the double slash there. But if we run our tests, I should imagine that we actually fail here because we do get the double slash. That's good. And again, some logic to fix this. Let's again use a private function, and we'll get another path again this time. And again, we can use substring here. We could say if substring starting at position 0 and going one character in is equal to that slash, then we can return the substring of that path, but skipping the first character, in other words, the character at position 0. So we just start from 1, which basically avoids the leading slash. However, if we don't start with a leading slash, then just return the path. Okay, so we need to use this. So what I'll do here is say our new file name is going to be equal to the outcome of ensuring it has no leading slash, which is a bit messy, honestly, because we're overriding the variable, but it should do the job. So let's give it a shot. And that looks good also. Now, even though if we don't pass in a constructor argument, we're going to blow up in a manner that's not really related to our project. In other words, if you're trying to construct an object, but you're not passing in the required constructor arguments, that's nothing to do with our particular program. It's just a PHP thing that's going to blow up. But we could write a test for it all the same. And what we'll do is we'll just say it throws if not constructed properly, and simply this should throw during instantiation if we override that constructor and say this be constructed with nothing. In other words, we're not passing in any arguments we expect this to throw. So let's see if that passes. Yeah, so like I say, I mean, we don't really need to do anything there because that's just the way that PHP behaves. So whether that test is worthwhile or not is a judgment call, really. I'm really showing it more to show that PHP spec can do that rather than this being a practice that I would do in a real project. So one thing that I need to do here is to make sure that I've got a service definition for this wallpaper file path helper. So inside app, config, services.yaml, and of course it opens it in the wrong pane. Don't want that. In fact, I'm just going to get rid of all of these for the moment. It's getting very messy. Just open up the services YAML, and we'll just add in a service definition here for our wallpaper file path helper. We know it takes one argument, which in our case is going to be a parameter, and it's going to be the kernel root dir slash, making sure to get the slash in the right place there, upper directory, and then web images. So again, kernel root dir is a parameter provided by Symfony. It relates to wherever our app kernel is. Because app kernel lives inside app, we need to go up out of app, which is this section here, and then we can jump back down into the web images directory. And again, if you're using Symfony 3.3 onwards, you can swap this out for project_dir and get rid of those two there, and it's the same thing. Now we don't yet have the service definition in here for our wallpaper upload listener, which is part of the problem as to why the form submission itself is not quite behaving as expected. You don't need to worry about that just yet, however, but we do need to start using this wallpaper file path helper inside our wallpaper upload listener. So the first thing that I'm going to do is actually update the spec to include this new knowledge. So we've got let the file mover, so we're expecting to receive that as one of our constructor arguments. So say wallpaper file path helper, and then we'll add that in as a class property also. We should all be set up there. And it's the second test that we're interested in. So maybe if we open up the file as well, under event, listener, wallpaper upload listener, and we'll do the same thing here. So say wallpaper file path helper, and this time we can just alt and return on the Mac over the variable to initialize it for us. And again, that brings in the appropriate use statement. And so we know that our new file location can be got by going to the wallpaper file path helper, getting the new file path, and the way that we get the new file path is to give it the file, which can tell it the current file name. So let's just split this so we can see exactly what we're doing in our tests. I've still got the spec open there on both panes. Okay, so in our test, we've got this file get existing file path and get new file path. These are the wrong bits of information that we saw at the very start of the video. So let's change these up, and we'll say get path name will return our fake temp path, and then we'll change fake real path to be fake file name, changing this to reflect that. And then we'll change this here to say get file name will return our fake file name. So we need to make some further changes here. We no longer have this fake real path directly. So let's set up what should happen inside here when we get to this wallpaper file path helper get new file path call. So say this wallpaper file path helper get new file path, and we expect that to be called with our fake file name. Looking at this, file get file name is what it would actually be called with inside our method, and when file get file name is called inside our tests, we return this fake file name. So in that case, this wallpaper file path helper get new file path should be called with that expected property, and when it is, we would like it to return some path here. Now this some path here needs to be whatever we expect ultimately file mover move to be called with, because the outcome of that gets stored into new file location, and that's what we're passing in as this second property. So that's where that matches up to. So say a fake new file location is just going to be some new fake, and then we'll just concatenate that with our fake file name. That means we can change both of these, and let's see where we get with our tests. Excellent. So just to quickly recap here, this particular line, or set of lines, purely because of the amount of space that I've got on the screen, is actually really powerful. What we're doing here is checking that our dependency has the expected method call and it gets called with the thing that we expect as well. So if we change this up, this would never really get triggered because it's expecting us to pass through this fake file name, and that all happens because of the way that we've set up our test. And finally, when we actually receive that call that we expect, then we can tell it what to return. So hopefully that's been useful to you, and we will see you in the next video.